go, guys. Our workshop tonight, Dr. Engel has prepared a report for us to review that looks at budget projections for the coming years. The financial context that we are in and the decisions that we may be making and what levers we have left to pull as we look to balance our budget. So I will turn it over to you, Dr. Engel.
Yeah, we're a fair month beyond the passage of our budget for this school year, and so it is still early in the budget process, but in anticipation of some significant decisions we have to make in the near future, and building on what one of our public speakers mentioned, how have things changed since we put together our projections in the spring. Wanted to put together our early assessment of budget projections as we move forward into the next year and the next 5 years. Ms. Sprang and I went over these numbers, and Ms. Sprang has some other tools that she's used to evaluate things independent of this particular calculation, and they come up pretty similar. And so we feel confident that this is the trajectory that we're on. So any budget projections rely on some assumptions, and we want to be clear about what those are so that we can kind of plot out what things may look like in the future. So our revenue assumptions are state funding remains stable at $325 per year per student. That is probably an optimistic assumption. Our state biennium budget this last year, Governor Evers ensconced that 325 in state law for something like 2,000 years or something, or 400 years. 400 years. However, state law, especially as it relates to finance, is as good as the next biennium, and so it will be negotiable. But the benchmark now, the standard is now 325. And so it would take an act of the legislature and the governor in concert to change that. So we're using that as our assumption. It may be slightly optimistic, but it is state law, so we feel like we can use that. The average of the last 10 years since Act 10 has been $130 per student. So this is substantially more than what we have typically received as a school district. We used enrollment projections from the report we gave last month, and we used the median, the more optimistic median projection, which includes stable 4K in kindergarten.
Are we talking about this chart here?
I'm just running through the front side real quick, and then the back side kind of gets into the finer points of it.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So, so the more favorable medium outcome includes stable 4K in kindergarten, which led to an average of declining enrollment of minus 136 per year, and that's on a 3-year average. So it's using the revenue limit worksheet, the 3-year average. So it's kind of smoothed over time. It's not quite so spiky as we might see otherwise. The referendum funding increases by $325 from this school year to next school year, and that's part of that step up as a part of that referendum. But ESSER funding ends, reducing our revenue by $2.7 million.
Did ESSER funding exist? When did it start, and what does it pay for?
Yeah, we started receiving CARES Act money in 2020, and then it turned into ESSER 1, ESSER 2, ESSER 3, and we've spent out ESSER 1 and ESSER 2 funds. We're in the process of spending out ESSER 3 funds.
Is that state or federal funding?
Those are federal funds that pass through the state.
During COVID, correct? I mean, these were COVID dollars that were...
That's correct.
Thank you.
Yep, COVID dollars. And we made every attempt not to offset school district budgets with those funds, but to truly layer on additional things that our students need to impact their educational outcomes. However, given the lack of state funding over the prior 2 years, in this year of the use of those funds, it was to offset ongoing operational expenses. So it does impact our ability to operate if we don't have those funds into the future.
So but what does it buy? equipment, staff,
Oh,
particular
yeah.
kind of staff? Like, what does it buy?
Absolutely. So we did an air handling project at Central to improve the air quality. That was a part of COVID.
Sure,
It was an
they had a lot of
antiquated
that.
system. Other things that we did were, gosh, we had a huge document about that. But our behavior and academic coaches that are in our elementary, middle, and high school buildings. We expanded cultural resources for students who'd been historically marginalized to add more external supports for those students. We bolstered the Be Great Graduate program in partnership with the Boys and Girls Club. We implemented science of reading training for our staff. We put together a kind of a homegrown program to develop reading specialists, reading teachers in our school district. We did a lot with 4K and early childhood. We piloted an all-day 4K program at Northside and Hamilton to see what the impacts of that might be. Dr. Harsey, Ms. Sprang, any?
First year, we had a nurse, an additional nurse was funded through that during the COVID recovery, because we had all the testing and all that to do.
So maybe the question when we get on the backside is, what would I mean, these are good things, don't get me wrong.
Mm-hmm.
But when grants go away, sometimes you just can't do what you were doing with the grant money.
Totally.
And so, what would we project that those funds would be used for in the future? And part of the question is, can we afford to do that? I think that's at least one of the questions that we would owe the public to explain that if they see this document.
Sure. So the funds are going away, and so where we had offset, general revenue to overcome a budget deficit, we have to adapt to that into the future. And that was part of the operational referendum, and we had set aside $2.5 million there to use for building projects to accommodate our middle school consolidation in year one, but in the subsequent year, it offsets that deficit. And so it's pretty much a wash. You'll see that here. It's about $2.7 million of ESSER funding change and $2.5 million of, referendum.
Oh, okay, I was going to
Yeah,
ask
so
what
it's
that was.
pretty much a wash. So the net is minimal. It doesn't significantly impact our budget as we move forward, the loss of ESSER funding because of the operational referendum.
Why does the ESSER funding change continue through those 5 years? I thought those funds needed to be spent out.
The grant itself goes away, but this year they were funding things like nursing and health assistance, things that we want to continue in our school district. It was to offset a budget deficit in our budget.
Right, because initially you said we were trying to budget as though we didn't have that.
Correct.
I don't speak budget as well, so I apologize. And then in these later years, we found the need to offset some deficits.
This last year, we had to offset our
this last
deficit
year,
to get
right.
through. We had talked about the board with that a year ago and decided to move forward with that strategy so that we didn't have to seek layoffs or other closures or other really challenging decisions at that time, knowing that if we passed an operational referendum, it would alleviate that challenge as we move forward.
For public consumption, I think it would make more sense on this back page if we didn't have the reduction in ESSER funding. And I think if they wash each other out, the thing on the bottom, it's just confusing. I think the public thinks if you lost funding from a grant, then you shouldn't be doing what you spent the money on. And if we spent the money on other issues, then we should identify it as other issues, not the loss of a grant. That's just for transparency with the public. I think that makes more sense.
Well, I think part of the confusing part too is that in the last biennium, the state legislature didn't give us any increase because they said you've got ESSER money. And so we didn't get any increase from the state, and they were telling us to use the ESSER funding for the increases that they want to give us. And so, I think that muddies the water
Yeah.
even more.
It muddies the water, I agree, but
And then we spent some money on one-off improvement and then some money ongoing in terms of positions and salaries.
Our goal in this was to identify the key drivers, and 2.7 million is a big driver in our revenues, and so we just wanted to capture that here. The April 23 operational referendum has a significant positive impact on revenues. It adds $4.5 million annually to revenues over the prior referendum. The offsetting expenses for this referendum are a 6% staff wage increase for the 23-24 school year and beyond, the continuation of critical teaching staff in buildings after ESSER funding ends, and an offset of a structural $2.1 million budget deficit. The result of these factors over the next 5 years is a decline in revenue that starts at minus 1.9 million in 24-25 and grows to minus 2.8 million in 28-29. Expense assumptions, wages increase by 3% annually. If the Fed reaches its target of a 2% inflation, then a per cell increase plus steps and lanes, we should be able to accomplish for our teachers with our existing compensation model. And so like a world that looks like that again, that would be what we would like to be able to accomplish, steps and lanes and CPI. CPI will probably be closer to 4% this year as it kind of slowly tracks downward for bargaining agreements starting July 1. And so 3% will not be sufficient to meet steps, lanes, and a CPI increase, but this is what we're looking at for this projection at this time. Health insurance costs, this is a tough one. Our medical loss ratio on our health insurance over the last 3 years has been over 120%, which means that for every dollar we contribute, we're spending $1.20. And so it's a loss for our insurance company. And that means that when they provide renewals, they want to cover that loss if it's consistent and predictable. It is. So we suspect that, well, in fact, when we got our renewal this last year, they had indicated that it would be a 22% increase, but it was capped at 9% under our contract. And then we worked together with our employees to bring it down to, I think, a 5% total increase, or 3%, 5%, must have been 5%, with some program changes. We anticipate a 20% increase. There's just, once the cap's off, like it's almost certain if we keep our plan exactly the way it is, we would see a 20% increase. We haven't seen with our program changes, there hasn't been a significant decline in the medical loss ratio over the first 6 months. Maybe it'll change a little bit with our next update, but we're being conservative in that projection as we move forward, and then assuming 5% each year thereafter, which is maybe a little lower than the industry standard, but we're hopeful.
And are we looking at, is there any added benefit to our teachers, our employees, of looking at a different co-op option? Because just for some context from CISA, like Cashton, right, for example, had an increase of 700% because of just a handful of really expensive cases that came up on their plan. And that is a narrative that is happening across our region. And so I feel like we're somewhat insulated from those bigger changes, the swings, because we're the bigger district. But I'm just wondering if we're looking at what we can do to even out the way that this is happening.
Yeah, we are going to bid this year, so we'll be fully surveying the market and working with our insurance committee, which includes representation from all of our staff member groups. We're exploring everything that's out there, health savings accounts, different HRA, we're looking at, what do different premium contributions look like, what do different deductible contributions look like. Our goal is to provide great benefits to our staff, though, and so we do not want to increase cost to them if we can help it. We're also looking at other models of service delivery through, independent primary care providers that's kind of decoupled from the expensive hospitals. Is there a way to have a standard like pay for service for the primary care so that we get more consistent cost, but you can do a lot more with that, and will that lower the costs over on this other side? The challenge we have here in La Crosse is that Wisconsin is the 4th highest state for expense for health insurance, and the La Crosse region is the highest in the state. And so there's just some real challenges with medical costs. We wanted to know, as we kind of dive into the data, is it a couple of outliers, some like one-offs of some cancer, some really challenging surgeries, some like significant long-term care. That's not the case for us. It is just generalized high expense. The one area that seems like an area of opportunity in particular is drug costs, pharmacy costs. And we're pursuing fully self-funding as opposed to self-funding through a co-op in order to take advantage of rebates and some of those things on drug costs in order to bring that expense down. So there's nothing that's off the table. We've got a great group that gets together multiple times a year and has really been thoughtful. Some great teaching staff and support staff that have supported those decisions. Dr. Jimenez has sat on that committee over the years to see what goes on there. And so we will leave no stone unturned, but in kind of conservatively budgeting, we're looking at 20% just to start. And if we can bring that down, awesome. But anything less than that would be naive, probably. Utilities and fuel costs increase by 5% each year. They rise faster than inflation, and that may be conservative as well, although fuel's down right now, so hard to know where that will go. And all other expenses increase by 1% each year. That is less than inflation, so that means we have less supplies and equipment every year, but, projecting something as opposed to full cuts. And then the one-time capital improvement budget addition that we used this year of $2.5 million out of the April 23 operational referendum, that'll end. So those one-time improvements to our middle schools will cease, and it will offset those ESSER funding losses. The result of these factors over the next 5 years is an increase in expenses that start at $1.6 million in 24-25. It drops the following year because the health insurance cost is a lot less, and so the increase in expenses for 25-26 over the prior year is $520,000, and it increases by about $100,000 each year until 28-29. The result of these budget assumptions is an average $3.2 million budget deficit annually. The projected net changes to revenues, expenses, and annual budget are identified there below, the kind of the top line or bottom line. And then the attached sheet, the backside, includes kind of more detail to pick into what it looks like each year. With the impact on fund balance listed in that graph. Pretty quickly, in probably 3 years, would require us to be borrowing on a regular basis to cover our short-term expenses.
So on the back page, help me understand, the per pupil limit increases by the 325, I get that. So then the state funding revenue, there's a decrease. Is that how come there's a decrease if that per pupil limit is going up?
Absolutely. So the state funding revenue, that's new revenue for the school district each year. And it's based on multiplying the projected enrollment right below that by that revenue limit change. So how many students do we have times new funding equals the state funding revenue that we would have that's new in the next year.
So this report is projecting that our enrollment will decrease by a little over 10% over this time period from 56-54 to 50-54.
Yeah, as long as we have stable 4K in kindergarten, that would be the case.
Okay. Would we be included in these numbers as a decrease in staffing? Because it seems if we have fewer students, that some will need some less staffing. Is that included in here?
That is not. So those are some of the drivers we have to balance our budget.
And I understand you don't lose staff for each individual, but when you lose chunks of students, there would be fewer positions required.
Totally. And then it's just a matter of how we want to accomplish that, right? So building consolidation is an example of a way to become more efficient with staffing, while providing a high level of service. It can happen in other ways as well. You can increase class sizes. You can cut support staff. You can, eliminate administrative positions. Each of those things can add into that process. And so.
But
It's also true, though, is it not, that, to Ms. Sukla's point about reducing staff, that's if you are losing enough students in a grade level.
Correct.
So if those students are dispersed, you may not have the ability to reduce staff because you still need enough staff in order to cover what we have.
Each
So-
individual year, the loss is difficult to manage in an individual year, but collectively over, because this is what we're looking at as a 5-year period, it's a 10% reduction. We're looking at losing 600 kids. Oh, 600 kids, exactly. I mean, we're going to have fewer staff, and so I would expect that there would be some reduction in staff,
Totally.
some calculation for that, which would reduce the amount of, yeah, and hopefully it'd be done through
Correct.
attrition.
Yep, we've cut our budget by $5.7 million in the 4 years I've been here. And that has mostly been through staffing, 80, 90% of that, because that's 80% of our expenses. We have done that through attrition with one layoff in 4 years and an offer to return over the summer. So we've been pretty capable of managing those staff reductions over time. But, it's been to the tune of, $500,000 or, $1.3 million of staffing changes. This is at another scale, if it were to solely cover our projected deficit at this time without some pretty significant changes to how we operate.
Just to be super clear and to illustrate what a reduction in staff means without a reduction in school buildings, can you explain what that would look like? Just so
What would make
listeners and board members, how does that impact students and staff, and families? How
And
would
programs.
they experience, and programs, how would they experience schools if we kept all the schools that we have, but we reduced staff to reflect the change in students?
Yeah, there'd be maybe a section or two here and there at our elementary schools that would collapse as a result of fewer students in those buildings. So it's maybe a grade level teacher here or there, and class sizes, in that case would remain the same. But to get to, $2-3 million in staffing changes, that would impact class size. You might have fewer grade level teachers, and so you would be pushing the upper limits of class size. We'd be at 18-to-1 across the board. Right now, one of our equity strategies is to have lower class sizes in buildings where there's greater need. We'd be unable to likely accomplish that. We'd have to look at increasing those class sizes at the upper elementary, where our goal is, 20, 25-to-1. We'd be looking at the upper threshold of that, for 4th and 5th grade, and to find the efficiencies there. At the secondary level, maybe it's, one less prep. Our teachers currently teach 5 of 8, at the secondary level, maybe it's 6 of 8, which is a common practice in our area. Our school district's attractive because we have that here, but that would alleviate, if those teachers weren't repurposed in some other way, that might be 10, 15, 20 teaching staff, that we wouldn't need any longer. We could share building administrators between buildings. That's common in other places, but it means you're never at the right place at the right time. We can support educator readiness and curriculum development less at the district level and eliminate positions there. Our supply budgets are just very limited. There's not a lot to cut out of those things. The budgets that we give our teachers to operate and our principals to operate is already so little. Maybe there's $100,000, a couple $100,000 there, to go from a $200 budget to a $100 budget for a classroom for a whole year. Then you start to look at the extras as opposed to the essentials, the behavior and academic coaches that we just put in place to help our students adapt to a pandemic and the mental health needs. Those are not as necessary as core teachers and special education teachers. There's radical things that people consider when it's dire straits, like athletics and extracurricular
If
opportunities.
you say band, I'm coming over there.
We're required to offer music, just might look different. There are some school districts that have grade level teachers teach art, music, and Phi Ed. It's not a best practice by any means, but it's within state law. There's other things around health. We have more health than is strictly necessary because it's good for kids. We should be teaching health every year if we can get it, but, we have it at key developmental opportunities, but, those are far beyond the state expectations. Alternative education programs that allow kids to graduate through Western Technical College. The support that we provide to the JDC is required, but maybe not as robust as we currently are. There's alternative education placements at Cooley Connections for students that have really significant behavioral issues. It's the cost of a Harvard education to go there, and it really alleviates a challenge in a building and supports those students, but comes at a pretty substantial expense. So there's lots of things that are out there, but unless we're looking for efficiencies to keep doing our job, our delivering education the way we have, then it starts to impact our ability to deliver education. And we don't want to think about any of those things. We want to add staff. We want to give teachers larger budgets. We want to have full buildings in neighborhoods where students have loved attending with their teachers, but we've got to face the reality and make
Yeah. And I
thoughtful
think
decisions.
In linkages, we hear from staff, they need more people, they need smaller classrooms, they need higher compensation. And then so what I'm hearing is like how students experience school, maybe the things that bring them joy would be potentially missing. And then for our students who struggle the most, the things that help them succeed and reach graduation would not be there.
It's possible.
It's the extras before the core things, and so those
Yeah.
are absolutely the pieces. And you mentioned teachers as well, and I didn't even touch on that, but attracting and retaining teachers could be impacted as well. When we were only able to provide a 2% raise instead of a 4.7%, we saw an increase in attrition, and that was damaging. When we were able to provide a 6% raise this last year, we saw a lot of happy staff. That makes a real difference in attracting and retaining folks. We have post-employment benefits that are an attractant to our school district, and it keeps people here at the later end of their career so that we have veteran teachers on our staff. That's another area where if we, think about that, we can certainly save money every year, so we don't have to contribute to that, but it impacts attracting and retaining high-quality teachers, especially as they get older, when they have a disproportionate positive impact on their teams and their kids, So there's lots of levers. The ones that get to large enough to move the needle, though, start to really have a significant impact on kids, unless they come through, thoughtful, creative efficiencies, which we're always seeking, and, we'll do our best to present those as we move forward.
Can you help me understand this chart that was presented to us tonight that is from the school district? That was page 3 of the presentation, of the projected budget deficits with this chart here, because they don't align.
Yeah. So that chart was put together based on our budgetary information and assumptions, gosh.
That was before the state budget was passed. So
Yeah, it was before the
this should
referendum
look
was passed.
more positive than this.
It was before the state budget was passed, before the referendum was passed, and so those were things that were, I think it included the referendum, because it was part of the referendum projections.
I think the referendum was included.
Yeah.
'Cause it looks like a slide from the referendum.
The passage of Spring's operational referendum.
What partially changed the trajectory was the significant loss in enrollment over this last year, and that updated projection moving forward. Those numbers from that slide were from projections that were functionally before COVID.
But so if you look at the 24-25 year, which would be the first year here, they're looking at a 1.2 not deficit.
Yep.
And here we're looking at a 3.5 deficit, yet the change in enrollment was only 1.3. So this is greater than what it should be, in my opinion, if that's the contributing factor to it.
Yeah, this is
And
just.
that doesn't include the 1.8 million increase for the revenue limits, which was not, which you didn't know about when you did this.
We put in assumptions about revenue in there as well. So there's, revenue assumptions behind that and enrollment assumptions behind that, expense assumptions behind that. And, this is updated for what we know now. So this is based on our current budget and what the changes are now that we know all of those factors. And some of those factors are more dire and some of those are better than we anticipated. If we lose, 102 students, then that is the impact that, we know that we'll lose $1.307 million for next year. That's already in our revenue limit worksheet for next year. That's known. And then the others are anticipated. The change in revenue limit, if that's our enrollment, that's the new funding we'll get. This is more accurate at this point than what we produced 9 months ago before we had some of this information. I wish we could go back to then and have those projections.
I'm struggling because, again, so we got 1.8 million more because of the revenue limit increase.
Mhm.
However, the change in students just for the first year is a decline of 1.3, so we're ahead by $500,000. You probably didn't project 20% health insurance increase, and I think your
Correct.
number is probably pretty on target there, so there is an extra 1.7 million that we'd be spending, but, so that would, in my mind, make us only 1.2 million worse, which would be about even, if you, based on what these numbers were, and we're still at 3.5 down. I'm struggling with what
It's the
fundamentally
starting-
shifted.
It's the starting point, right? Because we had such a drop in, we had such a decline in enrollment this year that we didn't know 9 months ago. So our jumping off point for the budget from 24, 25 decreased dramatically from where it was.
How many students did we lose this year? 150?
Yeah,
Well-
so
174 butts and seats.
174 times that, so that's almost if you take those two and extrapolate, we're
That's
on
about $2 million.
3.5, almost a $4 million gap. Which is what's, plus the 20% increase in health,
That
that's where our
accounts for
gap is. It's not, Deb, I see what you're seeing, but it's just the starting point moved.
The positions hired with the ESSER funding, are those accounted for under expenses, wages, and wages-based benefits?
They are.
Then why are we booking and why are we accounting in revenue the loss of that funding? If we've already adjusted the expenses for that, why is that even showing up there?
We haven't, they're still in the expense. We haven't taken them out of the expense because those are the academic and behavioral positions that were funded by ESSER, but we passed the referendum to keep them.
Right, but.
But
why
aren't
are
we taking
showing-
them out of the revenue as well? Am I following you right, Katie?
Yeah, I feel like if you have a grant for $1 million and your grant ends and you adjust your operational expenses to accommodate the loss and continue the program, you wouldn't continue to book a negative $1 million indefinitely.
So the $2.7 million there was used to cover Fund 10 expenses this year. It wasn't used for extra things that will go away. It was used for core budgetary items.
In other words, it's a structural deficit.
Yeah, and then part of the referendum was to continue those ESSER supports indefinitely, but part of the referendum was also to cover a future, that deficit that we covered with ESSER funding for a year. So the $2.5 million later on, right, covers more or less that increase, that offset of Fund 10 expenses. I'm not doing a good job of explaining this.
I'm having a hard time.
You need like a
Is a
chart,
way,
Yeah.
is a
like
way
a
to say it,
whiteboard.
and correct me if I'm wrong, so when I see a negative number under expenses, that actually means an increase, a positive number. A negative expense is actually
Right.
money coming in, so that's 2.5. A negative 2.7, those two together would offset almost equally about a $200,000 deficit. So what I'm hearing you say is
No, but
the
they're
monies
added
that
together.
are gone from the ESSER fundings are showing up because we are also covering them with the referendum capital budget change. So really, you could remove them, but we would still need to show the difference between the two.
So we used one-time money, grant money, to cover a permanent expense.
Which
So
you
we
should
used,
never do.
so we used one-time money to cover a permanent expense, which is a choice we made this last year because we had no new state funding to get through a year. It was to avoid really painful decisions this year so that we could use the referendum to get down the road. So when that one-time money goes away, we have a revenue loss of $2.7 million, and that's permanent if we want to keep everything that we have. And to Deb's point earlier, we will likely have to reduce staff along the way. The referendum increased our revenues by $4.5 million every year over the prior. And some of that money was used as a one-time expense, $2.5 million, to cover maintenance at the middle schools. Once that one-time expense goes away, we have $2.5 million for the next 5 years to cover
Other things.
like that ongoing deficit of revenue that we covered with a one-time revenue through the grant. And so those two offset. And I wanted to include them for transparency's sake, but perhaps it's complicated things.
So the
Be clear.
2.7 million in ESSER funding change is not, and the reason it's the same number across the board is that it's not the total amount of ESSER funds that we're losing. That is the amount we use to cover our deficit.
Therefore,
For
it's
one
And that
structural
deficit remains, it's,
Forever.
okay, thank you.
Yep.
Yep.
But in the revenue area of the budget, a negative number would indicate a loss, not money coming in.
Probably change all the minus and plus signs depending on your, how you view accounting. I'm not an accounting person. So I think of it as a loss of revenue.
It is.
Right,
So it's like a loss to me is like a negative.
right,
So it's a loss of revenue, so it's minus $2.7 million.
right, that's.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
that,
But then
that's
And these-
consistent
the
with how I've
referendum-
seen other
that negative
Yeah,
expense.
so yeah.
Right.
That's
It's
money we
coming
can
in.
use elsewhere,
Right.
right? So those two offset with a difference of about 200,000, 300,000 actually.
Oh, all right, so so the negative 2.5 in expenses, then the reason that's able to be carried across is because we fixed $2.5 million of things we would have been paying for.
One-time expense that's now gone, that money is freed up for something else.
Okay.
So that expense
Conceptually, that
decreased.
makes more sense to me,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah.
Was that, so that money is in the 23, the 2.5 million one-time expenses in the 23-24 budget?
Correct.
Thank you.
Yep.
Was that operational referendum the same amount for each of the 5 years? I thought it was graduated.
It went up by 325, so there's an overlap in it.
First year was different.
The
Yeah.
first year was different,
Okay.
so it's a little bit less in the first year. And then in the second year, the sum of the two referenda, like, if you add it all up, it increased by $325,000. You know, the total that we had accessible to us in
Right.
23-24 to 24-25.
So it's 10 million, in the subsequent years, it's $10 million a year. The prior referendum was 4.1.
Right.
Mhm.
Exactly.
Right.
So what's the next steps?
Yeah.
I think
So I think.
we've got to get some actual budget projections that actually project out your scenarios that you would like to see, because I think there's multiple ways you can go per our conversations. There's an attrition while keeping buildings. We'd like to see that, there's an actual trend line that shows us that attrition, so we can actually see what the true gap is going to be if we go that route, if that's your proposition. What's that look like? If you consolidate the building, what's that trend line look like? What's the services? But I think, to my comment earlier, every conversation we have is in a negative tone.
Yeah.
We shouldn't be having these conversations in a negative tone. We have to have real conversations about what the numbers are. But ultimately, I think what everybody that comes sit in our audience, what we want to see is what's it gonna look like? If I'm a parent, and I'm being proposed if we are gonna consolidate something, and if that is a choice that we choose to make in the future, not saying it is, until we actually see the scenarios, what's it look like? What teachers and staff are gonna be there, what am I gonna get out of this, what kind of support am I gonna have, what's gonna change, what's the risk rewards? Like, that's the stuff I think I need to see is, what are we gonna see? I think first we've gotta like, see some true numbers.
Yeah, so.
We're ballparking at this point.
And I've been talking with Aaron about how we received the long-range facility plan. And I've asked for proposals so that the board can see a variety of levers to pull. And then the board can feel informed about the ways that we could balance the budget. We can go out to our community and say, well, this was proposed, but I didn't like that because it affects people, this, whatever. So then when it comes time to vote, we know not just what we're voting for, but what we're choosing not to even consider. We've talked a little bit about how we would do that, like in meetings, and we're just going to schedule this out. Really, the board can decide. One of the things I've noticed is it's hard for board members to attend on non-board nights. And ideally, I want all board members to be here and engaging in the information that's given and asking questions so that we all feel like confident in our votes for this like big thing that we're hearing a lot about. I think it will help with the community anxiety we're all feeling, for the full board to be like engaged in this discussion, so.
I agree, and I also wonder to what extent it's feasible, or at least advisable, to take some of the kinds of suggestions we've heard, both in the linkages and from some of our public speakers, to say, okay, renting out space. Let's presume there's an appetite for that among businesses or organizations or whatever. How much of an impact could that, conservatively or optimistically make, right? Give us some levers to consider pulling, right? So that we have, like Jeff was saying, a full range of options in front of us and see, game out different scenarios and what the impacts are going to be. Whether or not I personally think it's a viable solution, I think it's in the interest of public accountability. We need to show that we're taking some of these suggestions seriously and trying to figure out if they will work, how they will work. So,
And I think to go back to, we've got two things. We've got costs and we've got revenue. And we have to impact our revenue side and continue to keep open enrollments in, continue to keep families in that can choose to stay in our district, in the district. These conversations, like this whole broad conversation that's happening in the community, is not helping our families that are choosing to come in, or families that are upwardly mobile and choose to move their kids out, whether that's private school or another district. So that's why I say I want to be very careful, at least that's my recommendation, is we're very, very careful on how we move forward and how we discuss everything going forward, because I think we need to be very diligent in what we're seeing. We're understanding the whole impact to our students and our families. We need to be expedient about it, but at the same time, I don't want to go fast, right? I don't want to be forced to make a decision because there's a budget lever. I want to make sure that we're giving this time. I also don't want to drag it out either. So, middle ground.
Yeah, I think it's hard because, on the one hand, we're hearing from a lot of staff, like,
they want to go fast.
this is so painful.
It is.
Help us get over this.
Yeah.
But these are decisions that are going to affect the district for decades. And, I think there's somewhat of a misconception that like, oh, it's not my school, so I'm safe. But this is a full district.
We have to look at
impact,
redistricting, we have to
so-
look at the boundaries, because it's going to have to balance schools and make sure that those administrators have the support network in place at those schools and support those students and those families. Like, it's a big discussion. I mean, the FAC was just a small discussion about a big topic, and I think we have to have a really big discussion about this. So, sorry, I'm passionate about this. I want this to go well, and I want us to be very, very informed, and I want it to be transparent.
I completely agree with you.
And I don't know that we need to explore every idea that's come to the table.
Agreed.
But I think there are some that are gaining some traction in discussions in the public. that we should be looking at. I know it's the extent of the dragging this out is it's been described by staff, it's certainly been difficult for them. But what bothers me more is the anxiety it's putting in our students. When little kids don't know if they're going to get to go to school with their best friend next year, and it keeps them awake at night, and it does, it's not an exaggeration. That bothers me to no end. And what it takes for us, if we have to have extra meetings or whatever, we need to get this figured out. We need to come up with a plan, at least some answer for somebody, whatever it is, to whatever, how we're going to proceed. I think, I have some ideas in my head that I think we are pretty feasible, that we can move forward, and I think the community could support. I don't know how the rest of the board feels, but it just bothers me what the kids are going through. That bothers me a lot.
So I will say on the extra meeting, that is an option, but we need to, I would prefer full board present, because this is a very serious issue, and I am conscious of like the optics of the board being like fully invested and involved in this, right? So I am hesitant to do that because I'm mindful of busy schedules and people have full lives with families and careers and other commitments. So my goal is to, within our regular board, we have regular board business. We may need to, if we have big questions and concerns, email the administration ahead of time so we can have good, concise conversations, feel ready to approve the monitoring reports or not, move on, dispose of our business. So then within our board meetings, we can give significant time to the long range, the proposals that are going to be coming before us.
I wonder if it seems like that would result in more workshops around the long-range facility plan, which typically happen at the end of the night after we've gone through an hour of impassioned public speakers, on a Monday night after most of us anyway, had a long day at work, and I wonder if it might be more advantageous just for our headspace to either start with the 5 p.m. workshop or have workshops on the off Mondays that we don't meet, so we're fresher and don't have decision fatigue, fatigue in general.
Yeah, fatigue, capital letters.
Yeah.
I guess, what does the board, are board members available on other
I would
Mondays?
love to, but it is difficult for my family. I don't disagree with Katie's suggestion to do the hard work first, right? But I'm just trying to think of, extra meetings and things, and, I'm getting home after picking up kids at 5 o'clock if I'm lucky.
Yeah,
So-
I haven't had
The
time.
organization of a 6 to 9 meeting can be whatever the board determines. You don't have to start with public comment. You can start with
A workshop.
an information item in the board meeting that addresses this thing, long-range facility planning, and turns to, at a certain point, public comment. Or you can end with public comment. I think it's
I
important.
would be concerned about telling the public that we're not going to listen to you until 8:55.
They also get access to watch the most important thing that they came to probably talk about,
We also
I
have a
agree,
lot
there's
of
a
work
trick.
to do, and a lot of the public comment is on repeat now.
Yeah,
And once we
At
make
a
the decision,
time
the
like
public
this,
comment will go down.
I want to continue having unlimited public comment, I don't want to be we need to only have 1 hour of public comment a night, or, I'm worried about putting restrictions on that with how it would appear as we do this work, right? Now you're silencing us when you're doing your hardest work that's affecting us. So,
And if the board decided
flipping the
that,
workshop early.
we're going to do an hour and a half of this, and then at 7:30, we can let folks know, hey, our public comment period will start at 7:30. We have an agenda item on a regular board meeting that starts before that, but public comment will start at 7:30,
That
so.
might actually work for some people's schedules better than 6
Sure.
p.m.
So there's a way to, I think, have our cake and eat it too there, and if the meeting goes longer, so be it,
Okay.
Can we not call these discussions going forward the long-range facility plans? I know it's going to be part of what we're talking about, but
Right.
this goes beyond buildings. This is people. So this is strategy, district strategy,
District
district
strategy.
something, but I think we've got to take it past the conversation of buildings, because I don't know if that's where we're going to end. We could.
Reverse growing pain strategy.
But to your other question on like scheduling and everything, I think we can keep the agendas to the minimum as action items we have to take action on, public comments from our actual sessions to open up more
Everything we
time.
do is something we have to do.
Is it?
But, I mean, there's areas where I can, you know,
Can we change our monitoring schedule to allow more time, right? So
Or we
can-
could just push some reports out a few months so we
That's what
can
I'm
power
saying.
through this. We
So
could do
just
that.
because I think the public cares about this, we
Yeah.
care about this, the district cares about figuring out the budgets for the next however many years.
Right.
Like, yes, we need to do what we have to critically do.
yeah, I mean, like, I really don't want to lose sight of the results monitoring, you know, like, since that's our biggest reason why we're here, right? Like, so pushing that aside,
For a couple meetings, I think is okay.
We can be
Parliamentarian.
judicious in how we approach it and look at the schedule and see
What's
what makes
available.
sense.
yeah.
I agree, we don't want to,
Right. We can't
Especially
totally, do away with the work plan, but like, this is also unprecedented, so.
If building consolidation were to
Well,
occur,
actually, it is
a
precedented.
decision
totally
should be made
precedent.
Yeah, I know, we did it
by
before.
early March. And so it's really a 2-month period where we have to focus on a topic for
It's 4
the,
meetings. It's 4 meetings.
So
Yeah,
within
4 meetings.
4
That's
meetings.
it, that's not a lot of time.
Do board
Mhm.
members, is
5
that
minutes.
enough time?
Depends what we see.
4 nights to
I
talk
think we have
about
to
it?
adjust our 6E and push some things back and, I
But
mean,
if-
again, because.
If 4 nights is not sufficient, do board
Yes.
members commit to coming
Yes.
I think we
Saturday
can,
morning?
I think we
or-
can do it for 4 meetings. I believe we can.
I mean, we're all doing our homework, and I'm sure we all have opinions about what might work and what might not, and I'm looking forward to hashing it out. But
Yeah.
and I will say my goal and however we proceed is to make as many people satisfied as possible. And all of the commentary we've heard is helpful. The conversations I've had with board members has been helpful. The strategizing and creative planning we've been engaged in, takes what the facility advisory committee recommends and goes beyond. So I think we'll be able to flesh out some pathways that use different frames of reference to provide things the board can say, no, we hate that idea, we're going to reject that one, and pathways where the board says, I like the bones of this, let's explore that a little further, and things that hopefully preserve as much as possible and invest and rejuvenate and renew our school district as well. So I think, there's stuff out there that we can pursue that will be in keeping with the intent of the Facility Advisory Committee and reflect all of the commentary we've heard and allow the board to successfully choose a path that attracts and retains teachers and invests in students.
Are we at some point going to start out with a conversation about where each board member is on things? Because I think, otherwise it seems like we continue to react to what administration presents to us. And I think there's some value in the community knowing that the board is driving this and not reacting to things.
I think for me, some of it is like, I don't know where I'm at until I know what's at stake. So like when I asked Dr. Engel, like, what if we do nothing? How are people going to experience that? How are students and our teachers and families going to feel the loss of resources, money to things, if we do nothing with our schools? For me, there's like a lot of hopes about how things might turn out, but like, I always have the fear of if we don't, like, what if we have to do layoffs, And so like, I can't say that like anything in particular is off the table unless I know like completely what's at stake, if that makes sense. So while it's, like, I get it, like the reacting to something the administration proposes, like, without knowing what all those levers look like, it's hard for me to be like, this is a non-starter for me, this is where I stand on things.
if you've got ideas, happy to schedule a conversation or shoot me an email or a phone call. Happy to incorporate any thoughts that folks have into the range of options that are available to us, so.
Yeah, definitely share ideas. And like,
So what's the best way to do that? Like, we can sit, I know we don't want to extend what we're doing now, but, I mean, I think to Deb's point, as a broader group, I think we need to understand where we've had side conversations with each other, asked questions on where people stand to a degree, but like, at some point, we all have to really understand where we're at as a starting point.
And I think the public expects that. I think that the
Right.
public expects that we stand up and say, this is what we're thinking, and this is based on our conversation. We're all grown adults that are professionals, and we will come to consensus, and we'll start a consensus on a few areas, and then we drill down on those. I think to have everything open, it's just hard to manage that. That's just my.
So what you're saying is everybody gets to make a PowerPoint and present their plan.
five-step
No, I
plan
don't-
to economic success.
I don't
And we
think so.
might-
That's what I'm hearing.
We might move.
I mean, if you really like doing
I mean-
PowerPoint, it's far be it for me
As
to
we
stop.
hear
Yeah,
different
I've
ideas.
gone back and forth 2 or 3 different times. as I've
So
heard
I
this,
guess
you know.
like, what would that look like with an absence of proposals from the administration?
I don't know, because I don't feel like I have the information I need to put my stake in the ground about anything at this point.
And
Isn't the
that's-
proposal the FAC report? Isn't that
That's
where we
just a
start?
That's a
recommendation of a
recommendation.
way
And that's not where
forward.
we start and then move from there?
The way I interpreted
Deciding
the
what we do with
FAC
that could
was,
be-
it was a recommendation from a community, a group of representatives from the community to the district, and then the district would fold that recommendation into proposals in a long-range facility plan. So the way I have interpreted it over time is there's like a constellation of information and data that we are receiving as board members. And the FAC recommendation is a piece, and community feedback is a piece, and budget projections is a piece, and facility information, like, correct me if I'm wrong, but the board the plan was the board would receive a long-range facility plan updated, taking into consideration FAC recommendation and feedback from the community and all of the other work that went into the FAC 8 months of time. And then the board would receive that and vote or not, or grapple with it.
And what I'm hearing from board members is the idea that there should be pathways and options to explore. And so I can imagine in January 8th, say, board meets, we review the facility advisory committee report, like, take a look at it, reactions, thoughts, okay. Here's a long-range facility plan that incorporates that, plus everything else, and includes optionality for board members as places to jump off or fully fleshed out pathways to consider. And then discussion and initial thoughts and like what resonates and what doesn't resonate, keeping within our assumptions and limitations and whatever else, then the board at that point really gets to grapple with, take this one off, we're not interested in that, or we want to explore this further and see what the other budgetary implications are. And then in January 22nd, explore that further, review some additional information, requests for information that the board might have. We want to see results on this idea, this idea, this idea. Tell us what that looks like. And then we present that information to the board and flesh out those preferred pathways further. And then in February, those 2 meetings, kind of continuing to evaluate and refine that to something that the board thinks they can support on a majority basis, or 2 plans that are up in contention and we'll have to pick a path, whatever it might be. So that by March, the board feels comfortable with a comprehensive plan moving forward. I feel it's my responsibility to provide some groundwork for the board to get started with, as opposed to you all trying to come up with it, from your position out of thin air. That's a thought.
I still think the public is looking to us as a board. I think that we have some obligation to the public with coming up with that. I would hope that this whole process could come together a lot more expediently than March. I think January and February, we can knock this thing out. I think there will be some hard decisions and things that will become clear. I don't know who's calling me, stop calling me. And
Yeah, I think before March would be ideal. I don't think my little cold heart can take it that much longer.
I don't, well, you're in a really tough spot.
Perhaps you'll
Well,
see
we
something
all,
on
like,
January 8th that y'all love, and you approve it that night,
Then
and we
it's
get out of
done.
here, and
Yeah.
we're done. That's a possibility.
Yeah, probably will.
Totally.
Yeah.
I hear what you're saying, I think, Deb, but I don't think that it's mutually exclusive from having some framework for our discussions as well, because what it feels like to me is that having us lead this as a board and having that be kind of the goal requires us to come with a plan. And while I have some ideas that I could certainly like put on a spreadsheet or whatever, or on a PowerPoint, and we could walk through that, I don't see quite as much value in my generalized theory of what we should do as a plan that is based on if we, move X, Y, and Z, if we cut this program, if we repurpose this position, like if we have something to start from and react to in that sense, that's not undercutting our leadership in this. Does that make sense? I don't know if I'm expressing myself well.
I'm antsy. I'm just.
No,
this-
I'm losing sleep over this. I don't know about you all, but like, it's, I
And I'm
want to get
struggling with
moving
just to
on
talk
it.
about the
I
process.
wanna-
I'm ready to jump in.
No, I understand, and like, I'm also coming at this, public deliberation was my entire dissertation. This is something that I have spent time thinking a lot about for a long time, and how to have structured discussions around difficult issues that bring as many voices to the tables. And I'm as anxious as you are to get going with that process, but I think there needs to be a framework to start that process there.
So I guess like in the accountability piece, like, is there a way to, demonstrate to the community the path that we're taking to come to the decision? I mean, like, it's hard if you're not on the board and you don't look at the agenda and see what the next meeting will cover, right? Like, you just feel like at any point, they're gonna make this choice, and then I maybe lost my chance to say something. And I think that's why we will continue to have a lot of public speakers, but, when we approved the budget, there was a lot of confusion one night because they thought we were closing a school that night. And we were not, it was not on the agenda. But there's a lot of, anyway, like, I think in Deb's comments about like wanting to inform the community of like what's going on, there is maybe an option of having the strategic, like, we are presented with information that we can say yes, no, respond to, but also giving the community like the plan, like, we will spend this many meetings doing it like this, we're receiving reports, like, you can expect this kind of discussion and this kind of work. The outcome will be a vote at no later than this date. That way, to the community, it shouldn't appear like they aren't sure when it's happening or what's happening.
Transparency and process, right?
Yeah, because a lot of people are taking this as though the FAC recommendation has been decided and that's what's happening.
Yep.
And I know we don't think that, but.
Right, but it's out there.
Correct. So I think, to your point, I think if we can give that to the community to start and say, here's our plan, here's our process, here's where we're going to start, here's what we're going to be requesting, here's the information we're going to be reviewing, all those kinds of things, I think will help everybody understand the process and ease their way through it, and it might help us build your meetings on how you want to structure the meetings. So,
I can propose a structure to Annie, and you can share it by email in advance of our next board meeting. We can talk about that publicly. You won't be here, but we can certainly do that publicly. And here's our process. Once we kick off in January, this is what it will look like, and we won't go past this time. And, there's I think, an opportunity for that transparency and process to give people a clear understanding of what's going to happen next. And we can put out a press release around that and talks clearly about the FAC as a recommendation. It's not a decision,
it's one part of what we're
Yeah.
going to be discussing.
And in any release, like, we are very grateful for all the time and effort and expertise and the emotional work that the committee, like, through the work of being transparent about where the board sits with recommendations and the whole world of information that we're sifting through, like, I don't want to lose sight of how grateful we are for the work that they did and that it was valued and, right, like, that should be like part of the message.
Because otherwise, if we ask community members to step up the next time, and they just feel like they've been put through the ringer, we're gonna get nobody.
Yep. Okay. Any other last comments on this before we did lose track a little bit with budget conversations, but I consider it all looped in because it's all about budget. Any last things on budget?
I hate it.
Yeah, me too. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you for this.
Merry Christmas.
Absolutely.
Annie. I wonder